name's Mark Billingham. I'm a crime novelist. I've also been a television writer, and my own novels have been adapted for the screen into a crime drama series. Thanks to that fantastic montage with the awful music. They wouldn't let us clear watching The Detectives. There you go. So we were left with that. We've now been reminded of some of the great crime dramas of the past, from Marple to Morse, Dixon to Dalgleish, and I'm joined on stage today by three people uniquely positioned to talk about crime drama on television, its history, the place that some of today's drama may come to have in that criminal pantheon, and what the current state of play is with what is arguably the most enduring and popular of all television genres. Starting on the far side, Jane Featherstone is the Chief Executive of Kudos Film and Television. When Jane joined Kudos as the head of drama in 2000, she was responsible for getting the BAFTA-winning Spooks off the ground, and since then she's built the company into a leading force in UK and global drama. She's overseen a slate of programming for a raft of different broadcasters, including Law & Order for ITV, The Aftermath and The Hour for BBC Two, while developing and exec-producing an impressive catalogue of award-winning thrillers and crime dramas, including the double Emmy award-winning Life on Mars, its sequel Ashes to Ashes, Hustle, and of course the phenomenally successful Broadchurch, which is an enormous hit here and is currently as much of a sensation on the other side of the Atlantic. Next to Jane, Neil Cross is the author of several acclaimed novels, including Always the Sun, Burial and Captured, as well as the best-selling memoir Heartland. He was the lead scriptwriter for Series 6 and 7 of the BBC spy drama Spooks, and is the creator of the multi-award-winning BBC crime thriller Luther, which now screens in more than 160 territories worldwide. Neil continues to write for the screen, both here and in the United States, and his current or recent projects include the third series of Luther, 2 yet-to-be-aired episodes of Doctor Who, and Crossbones, a new action-adventure series for NBC. His feature projects include a new adaptation of Day of the Triffids for Sam Raimi, and in 2011, Neil was included in Variety magazine's prestigious list of 10 screenwriters to watch. And next to me, we have Ben Stevenson, who has been controller of drama commissioning for the BBC since September 2008. Prior to that, Ben worked as script editor for Granada Television and development editor at Channel 4. He joined the BBC in 2004 as head of development for independent drama and subsequently became head of development for fiction. As head of drama commissioning, Ben has overseen development, production and strategy for BBC 1, 2, 3 and 4, as well as online, which has included output as diverse as the #1 Ladies Detective Agency, Criminal Justice, Shadowline, Last Tango in Halifax and many others. In the crime and thriller department, more recent BBC hits include Luther, the hugely popular Sherlock, and the highly acclaimed and controversial BBC Two drama, The Fall. As they're fond of saying on Radio 4 game shows, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel. When this panel was first mooted, and we were talking about this many months ago, one of the approaches that seemed to present itself to me was the notion that perhaps crime drama had grown a little stale. And this is something I found online. This is from the introduction to a crime drama module on a GCSE media studies course. So this is word for word what it says.
I did that.
Did you do it? Did you pass? No. Okay. You turn on the television and you see a policeman shouting at a suspect in a small dim room, banging his fist on the table with dramatic music in the background. You know without thinking that you're watching a crime drama. But how do you know this? You recognise the ingredients. Angry policeman, shot suspect, interview room, the close-up camera shot of the policeman's fist, serious music, dim lighting. So, there's certainly an argument for suggesting that unless something fresh and different came along, that the genre was perhaps in danger of becoming stale. Since then, however, with Broadchurch and The Fall, we've arguably had two of the most talked about crime dramas in the last 10 years. So I would go as far as to suggest that crime drama is actually going through something of a golden age. Jane, crime drama clearly fulfills a huge need from the viewing public. What do you think it was specifically about Broadchurch that fulfilled that need?
I think that it always starts with the writing. So Chris is the brilliance of his writing, but I think the thing that probably marked Broadchurch out, two things. It's emotional, so it makes you cry in a way that I think is one of the reasons I watch television, to laugh and to cry and to experience deep emotions in the comfort of your own living room. And that immersive experience of being able to get under the skin of the grief of that family and that community, and the experience of the police experiencing it in minute detail over 8 hours, I think meant that when the emotional impact was felt, it was greater than you normally get in slightly shorter, closed-ended dramas. I also think it was a beautiful place. It was incredibly engaging as a place to spend time, despite the dark things that were happening there. I think the beauty of the scenery, the landscape, the acting, all of those things together, and it's alchemical and you don't know how that's going to work, but I think that all contributed to make it an experience that you had to watch. And the deferred pleasure, Peter Fincham was talking about this earlier, I think that slightly old-fashioned now in an era of binge viewing, that old-fashioned pleasure of being able to sit down and experience it with the rest of the country was a massive part of it.
And was that something you were aware of while it was being made? I mean, to tap into it to the degree where Ladbrokes, you know, are taking bets on who the killer is. I mean, I don't remember anything like that happening since Who Shot JR.
No, I think that's exactly...
Doctor Who casting, okay, fine.
Oh, man. Anyway, no, it was a phenomenon. You know, the whodunit element, I think what was so brilliant about Chris's writing was that the whodunit element was, you know, one of the motors, but ultimately that was a disguise for the complex exploration of a community in crisis. Yeah, and that's what it was about, ultimately, was the community and a familiar story that we've all read about in the papers, a narrative we recognise, that he, you know, and that was what Chris was interested in doing, was exploring the community. But with this wonderful thing, so I think when the audience were talking about whodunit the next day, that wasn't really what was in their minds, that was just the way to engage in a conversation at the water cooler. Actually, the emotional response to it was what kept people watching, I think.
I mean, Broadchurch is brilliant, but I think the thing that's interesting about that is what's interesting about all the best crime drama, which is that crime's actually just a way of getting into a world, completely. But it's a way of making a world dramatic and interesting. And, you know, a show that had those characters but where nothing, a murder didn't happen, probably wouldn't be quite so interesting. And I think, you know, we've just made Top of the Lake, which isn't a traditional crime drama, but Jane Campion at the very beginning was very clear that she wanted, in her case, a disappearance and a sort of a question of abuse and paternity to be at the heart of it, because she knew that she had loads of complicated themes she wanted to talk about, and how the hell is she going to keep an audience watching something about a bunch of menopausal women in the camp and a fucked up drug family? How are you going to do that? How are you going to sew it together? Crime.
Come around my house at Christmas, though, doesn't it?
Well, no, you do live in New Zealand. It was quite closely based, actually. No, it wasn't. It really wasn't.
Well, let's have a. We've got a clip of Broadchurch. Let's have a look at an excerpt of Broadchurch. Although that clip introduced arguably the two major characters, the two cops. It's a different show again in that it's very much an ensemble piece, isn't it? Because it's about what the crime does to the community. Yeah. Was that something that Chris was very keen to?
Absolutely. So the community was the heart of it. And I think if fiction and drama, one of the things that it does is to look at the human condition, and transgression is where you can study the human condition, because that's where you see people at extremes. Then I think crime shows and police shows allow you to find transgression and give you that plot in order for you to explore that without needing to worry about the stakes, and I think that's really important. So, you know, to do an ensemble drama where you go into all those characters' lives in that detail without the narrative that just gave you the foundation that meant you could spend more time on that because you understood what the stakes were. They were life and death, and it was critical, so you were able to explore, as Ben said about Jane Campion, you know, it allows you to do complex things with this very simple foundation.
And Neil, Luther's a very different kind of show because it very much revolves around a central character. Yeah. Now in crime drama, you know, both in novels and on TV, very long tradition of the kind of the maverick, you know, the maverick central character, the maverick detective, you know, from Sherlock Holmes through to Jack Regan, you know. So where do you think John Luther fits into that tradition, and where is he different? How is he different from it?
Oh, controversially, maybe given the nature of the panel, I would slightly debate that Luther really is a crime show. I think it's got more in common.
Get out.
Yes, leave. I think it's got more in common with the X-Files of Doctor Who in many ways, in that you could say it's a Monster of the Week show.
Right, sort of Grand Guignol.
Yeah, absolutely. And it made no pretense at any point to reflect the everyday life of a London cop. You know.
Really?
Yeah, I know.
He had a badge and everything.
Yeah. I do love it when people say it's not very realistic.
I know. Thank God for that.
Yeah.
So that was your intention from the outset.
It was a conscious choice to do that kind of Grand Guignol, you know, and the kind of crime fiction on television had been CSI'd to its eyeballs by a certain point, you know, whereby every crime show seemed to be about a forensic team. And one of the interesting things about Broadchurch as well, is that what shows like that seem to me to do habitually and historically is they rob the victim of all moral stature. The victim just becomes the source of the puzzle. And this is a kind of an ongoing facet of British crime fiction, Golden Age onwards. You know, name one of Agatha Christie's victims.
Right.
You don't care about.
There's a bit in one of the Agatha Christie books where the butler's wife is viciously murdered, and 10 minutes later he's serving
No,
it with
quite.
cocktails.
That's the thing.
It's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Oh, golden times.
Happy days.
You know, these people are which is not to denigrate the form, because it's an honourable form, and it has many fans, and it produces a lot of good TV and many good movies. But it is nevertheless the case that the victims in it have absolutely no moral stature whatsoever. They're simply a way of rolling a 6 to start the game.
It's interesting. Well, Chris, you know, we talked about it a lot at the beginning of Broadchurch. We worked on Law and Order together, and he set up Law and Order UK for ITV, and which is still running and does a brilliant job. And I think, you know, he did an amazing job of setting that up. But Broadchurch was a response to that very directly for Chris, and he said that publicly. He wanted, when the bit, you know, you have one scene in every Law and Order episode. Dick Wolf always said, you know, hey Jane, Chris, you've got to have one scene where there's a victim so that you care. So there was one scene of some parent crying or somebody crying that you immediately had to empathise with very quickly, and then off, you were back into the story, out of it, and you never thought about them again. And Chris really, Broadchurch was very much an answer to exploring the victim's side of the story.
It's great, and everybody knows that Prime Suspect is a classic piece of British drama. I mean, rightfully so. But one of the interesting things about Prime Suspect is I remember the name of the victim. It's Della Mornay. It's because they talk about Della Mornay for 4 or 6 hours of television, however long. It's because she matters, and that's what, you know, it really hit home. Yeah, Danny Latimer, absolutely. You know, and the sense of, you know, I'm obsessed. I bored Chris Ridgett about this yesterday, but structurally, with the first 20 minutes of Broadchurch, it just on a purely structural, technical level, he introduces 17 characters, deftly and beautifully, but also with a growing sense of dread. I mean, by the time she gets to that soccer field, it's cool.
And the last 40 minutes of Broadchurch, you know, in that you're not building up to it. You go, this is the killer. And now, you know, I mean, we'll talk about endings and structure and everything.
And the next time is really interesting in that. I do think that's a really interesting decision that was made not to show the next time. And interestingly, Top of the Lake, which, as Ben knows, is my favourite show of the last 10 years. I think it's a work of
Apart
genius.
from the shows she's made.
Apart from the next times, which I stopped, I didn't want to see, because I'm like, well, she's got a pregnancy, that means she's alive, and it upset me.
Yeah.
And actually, I think that's a really interesting change that might happen.
Sometimes you do it though because the episode's a bit.
I know, and also, listen, we do it on everything else. But
Not wishing to reveal.
but it's interesting.
Okay, let's have a look at Luther. Let's run a clip from Luther.
There's not much of a mystery element to Luther. We know who did it.
Luther certainly, the show's never shied away from the horror of what this violence does to people, and nor should it. But what are your parameters? I want to talk a little bit about the portrayal of violence on screen. Yeah. What are your parameters as a writer?
I will go as far as I'm allowed to get away with. And I have to say the BBC have been inordinately supportive, Ben, particularly. You know, I'm a really big fan of horror. What I don't like kind of horror porn, torture porn. And I don't like, it's going to sound absurd to say, but I don't like gratuitous violence, by which I mean really violence which is designed to excite rather than terrify. I think if you get a cheap thrill from violence, then there is something wrong with what you're doing and what you're watching. I think if it terrifies you.
But you see, Neil, the reason Neil's so brilliant at genre is because he understands actually it's all about tension, plus extraordinarily imaginative ideas of then what happens. Because if you have tension and nothing happens, and there's a cat, you're like, oh, that's a bit crap, isn't it? And also if something happens, you think, well, I've seen that before. And what Neil does is understands that actually the first 5 minutes of Luther, it's all just tension. Nothing happens until he puts his hand on the bed. But apart from that, nothing happens. It's then the payoff is often not gory, but it's just incredibly unusual.
There's a
hand in.
There's a lot less gore in Luther than.
But it's the tension of it. It keeps.
There's a lot less gore than people imagine.
Absolutely.
There is. Because I mean, it's all about what is not shown, isn't it? It's all about sort of nudging the reader, the
but
viewer's
also,
imagination.
it's about 5 seconds of violence versus 2 minutes of tension. It's the classic Hitchcock trick. You know, violence by itself. That is when you get just violence for the sake of violence. If it's violence in order to tell story,
it's suspense. It's just
the
killing you.
suspense. It's
suspense
hideous.
in Luther, the series. I was saying to Neil, I had to actually leave the room where, you know, outside the glass,
love it.
window in the garden. And I couldn't watch it. It's just too terrifying. The actual moment when it happened wasn't as scary.
No, you're
It
like
was just-
relieved.
it
And
was the
sometimes
10
you're
minutes of
relieved when the thing
suspense.
happens because it's like a sort of you laugh and
Absolutely, no, it's a nervous. But what Neil does brilliantly as well, and I think a lot of the things that unite great crime drama is they create a world where they have their own rules.
Yeah.
So Luther is not realistic, isn't intended to be, but the characters have their own truth, and it works on the level of, you know, you invest in it as a piece of entertainment, and it doesn't matter whether or not, you know, Neil and I did Spooks together. Spooks 2 is not a piece of documentary television, and frequently we'd be told, well, you can't do that isn't realistic. Like, yeah, fuck it, who cares? You know, we just didn't care. And I think as long as it's within the rules of the world, crime can go anywhere and shouldn't be hidebound by the truth of crime.
Well,
I think there's a couple of, you know, hey, let's talk about me. But Luther, you talked about the maverick detective, and there's a certain kind of algebra involved in the kind of decisions that you make. In that when we talked about doing a kind of a self-consciously iconic detective, a hero, someone who was damaged by taking this youthful moral choice to do good in the world, then the only way to kind of articulate, to show that damage, is to amplify the kind of horrors that he deals with. You know, and if the kind of things that Luther dealt with weren't as kind of horrific and blood red as they are, then the character itself would make no sense in the world that he's walking in. We would you know, we'd lose sympathy, we'd lose understanding for who he is. Does that make sense?
yes, and also these things are meant to be disturbing. I mean, they are disturbing. If we're not disturbed by them, then there's something wrong. Which brings me on to The Fall. Now, one of the sort of the on-screen violence in that show was one of the reasons that The Fall attracted so much controversy. Were you aware, as the show was being made, or even in the early days when you were looking at the scripts or whatever, that this was a show that was going to generate quite so many column inches as it did?
See, I didn't even realise it had, but then that's probably because I don't read newspapers. But people have mentioned it to me. No, not really. I mean, you talk about lots of things when you talk about scripts, and one of the things we had lots of conversations about was its attitude towards crime, because that was the whole point of it, and its attitude towards gender and sex and sexuality. So there were loads of conversations about, well, the whole point of it was 2 points of view. The whole point of it was about making victims characters, as Neil says. Therefore, you're going to have to see the act of violence rather than just hide it in a room over there, because it is a piece on BBC Two. It is supposed to be exciting and incredibly watchable, but it's also supposed to be challenging, and it's also supposed to be something you love or hate, and that's fine. I'm really, really cool with that on BBC Two. So we had loads of conversations about, well, how far is too far in a show that's actually got quite a sensitive approach towards its issues, but then obviously also needs to go into some quite extreme places. So it was a constant, in development, it was a constant conversation, but actually, once that was sorted and Alan knew very confidently what it was that the piece was, we didn't give any notes, I don't think, on the violence at all.
Okay, let's have a little look at a clip from The Fall. Well, that was a clip from a show that the Daily Mail called the most obscene show ever made, which clearly proves you're doing something right. But it did, I mean, I suppose as chair I should remain neutral, but I nailed my colours to the mast and say I thought it was an amazing show, The Fall, and I was completely gripped by it all the way through, and I thought some of the stuff written about it was absolutely hysterical and very interesting. And I just wondered what you thought it was about that show that so touched a nerve.
Had a woman as a lead.
Right.
In many ways, and therefore I think it's a bit challenging that it's a piece about sexuality, and there's something, I think it's a very, very different tone, and I think that has a huge part to play.
Was it not also about the fact that the killer is sexy, loving, you know, he loves his family, he's attractive, there's nothing hidden. And I just kind of thought people were so disturbed by that. But there's a truth to that. I think monsters do not look monstrous.
No,
if they did, we'd catch them, you know.
No, they don't. I also think that a huge amount of sex, a huge amount of murder is about sex, a huge amount of sex in murder is about power. Therefore, it did conflate sex and murder. It did.
I think
And that is a bold thing to do, but it's truthful. You only have to look at the hideous news that comes out week after week about men's relentless attacks on women, whether it's over Twitter in verbal form or whether it's literal violent assault. Men against women, it is often at the root of it sexual in some way.
Well,
we unpicked it, and some people, and it made people uncomfortable.
Sorry, I mean to
No, go on. Sorry.
There's an interesting dynamic at play there, because what drives serial killers is essentially a masturbatory urge. Serial killers kill, on the whole, women in order to masturbate. But somehow that character in the popular culture has become detached from the masturbatory aspect of it, and they've become kind of extreme libertarians and kind of all anti-heroes, you know. And I think it was a psychic shock to some degree to the Daily Mail and others.
It's also that, I'm a huge fan of Golden Age. I love Agatha Christie and all of that. It's cosy though, you know. If you're feeling a bit crap, there's nothing better than seeing a murder being solved. We love it. It's a great part of our heritage, but it's not in any way actually about murder, and that's absolutely fine. The whole point of this panel really is ultimately there's loads of different crime, there's loads of different things, and there we go. The thing about The Fall is I'm not saying it was real because it was a very heightened piece of genre, but its themes were real, and I think it's interesting that that created controversy, whereas actually people being murdered and it's funny, and the murder's treated incredibly lightly, which I'm cool with again, but is never commented on. It's never talked about. Whereas actually, when you talk about women being murdered and sex and women having sex, something else I think made people uncomfortable, and violence, I think people get incredibly uncomfortable. I also think some of them maybe haven't watched it.
No, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was obviously a sort of quantum shift, as Neil was saying, in the portrayal of a serial killer once kind of Anthony Hopkins started winking and going, okie dokie, Clarice, and all that kind of stuff. But the simple fact is, Ted Bundy was considered too good looking to be a serial killer. He worked in a rape crisis centre.
People are still writing songs about him now.
Some of the stuff in that, and the other thing that I thought was very truthful that upset a lot of people was the ending, as we've just seen a clip from the ending. Because the simple fact is, an awful lot of cases where killers are being pursued do end with it just nothing. The killer just goes, I'm going to move.
Kathy Newman, who was interviewing Janice yesterday, asked the most ridiculous question. Sorry, Kathy. She said, presumably audiences won't go back to The Fall because they were disappointed by the end of the series. Felt like saying 4.5 million. But actually, they'd been fucking disappointed if she'd gone, I know who it is, there we go, end. Yeah. You think, oh really? What, it's just a conventional show then? Next week we'll move on to another serial killer. You know what, it's complicated. And for the last 5 minutes was just wrapping it up. It would have been horrific. And the point is that it's endless. And actually one of the things we talked about a lot was the BKT or the BTK killer in America, who was this very ordinary, not good looking, but very ordinary bloke. He had a family, he had children, he was a pillar of community. He murdered sort of in the 60s, in the 70s, disappeared, turned up in the 90s again. And I think we've got something more challenging to say about the way that crime evolves, and it would be insane for us to think, oh yes, you end.
It's also it's a weird part of our cultural psychopathology that murder in any way is considered acceptable as a form of light entertainment. I don't memorize.
But we'd be unemployed if
well, quite. But there's a great
bring it on.
There's a great Julie Burchill column, which isn't a sentence I can ever say again. When she was examining this contradiction, she said, "Can you imagine sitting down on a Sunday night to watch a show called Rape, She Wrote?"
I think there's two. I do think sexual violence is one of the hardest lines to cross. And I think some of the most complicated conversations I've had on shows has been the correlation between sex and violence, because I think violence, horror films, thrillers, feels heightened a lot of the time. The minute you put sex into the picture, I think it becomes something much more gritty and much more real, and therefore I think is a more complicated story. Not saying you shouldn't do it, we've done it, but I think it's where I have the most, not concerns, but the most questions about it. The other thing I was going to say, though, is that I think the reason Murder's entertainment is because, luckily, for most of us, it's never going to happen, and we're never going to touch it. And we're intrigued by it on the telly, so you want to see behind it. And actually, it's just a heightened experience. You know, women are the biggest audiences for horror movies, and it's because it's a heightened experience. It's a thrill ride, it's a ghost train, it's a, whatever those are.
Also for crime fiction. I mean, I used to work in the
Yeah,
bookshop.
it's
crime
totally
fiction,
female-led.
Massively female-led.
And what it is a huge umbrella. So that you have at the end, at one end of it you have shows like The Fall. At the other end of it you've got Midsomer Murders. You've got people who just want to escape into a world where the status quo is restored and they can go and put the kettle on or whatever.
Your sick books.
My sick books.
Yeah.
But have we got the balance right of those kind of cosy, you'll be all right shows, and shows that use crime as a way of looking at the world?
At the moment, yeah, I'd say we definitely have.
The last couple of years,
I think the last 2 or 3
has
years it's
shifted.
rebalanced that way, actually. I think Neil's right. The procedural CSI, MSIS stuff, probably not. And that was about the forensics, the gore, the process, which isn't fundamentally that interesting. And it's a miracle that many thousands of episodes were made, to me. But in a way, when we're looking and developing new crime dramas, they come from two places. And I worked on a series called Touching Evil a long time ago with Paul Abbott, a very long time ago. And that, I suppose, where they can come from and where I sit is writers want to tell a story about a man who, a character who, something which is a universal truth, and they use crime to facilitate that story. Or you come at it from the Touching Evil. Paul Abbott was interested in the FBI in America and their serial killer unit and the kind of people who chose to work in a unit that followed serial killers. And so that can come from, we want to do something that actually depicts this unit. And they're all valid now, but the balance now seems great to me.
I think
you've
it's
got Death
gone.
in Paradise on one hand, which is fun and doesn't pretend to be anything other than it is. Then you've got, Line of Duty and Southcliffe and Broadchurch doing completely different
I think
things.
it's gone slightly the other way, which
Yeah,
is I think
maybe.
actually there are many more Broadchurches, Luthers, that sort of the heightened, not saying Broadchurch is heightened, but they're big ideas. I actually think what we've moved away from, I quite like to get back, is the more conventional whodunit of the week, because I think it's a fantastic form. I think the truth is it's quite hard to find them that feel original. And actually, writers like Neil or Alan or Chris, they love this vision of ongoing stories, and it gives it more originality. Whereas an episode of the week now, perhaps post CSI, feels a bit like, do you know what, I've seen it before. I think it's actually time to reinvent that again.
Well, how much of this is to do with the influence of shows from elsewhere, of shows like The Wire and The Killing, so that what you now have are these stories unfolding over a much longer period of time? Broadchurch is 8 hours, The Fall's 5 hours. Is that going to be the norm from now on? I mean,
It'll swing back, I think. I mean, these things always do. For the next 2 or 3 years, we'll see more of those things, and that serialised experience will be one that we all love, and will continue for sure. But there will be, I think, like Ben, and we're developing some that are swinging back the other way, that are story of the week, but with a very strong, iconic character. And I think in all of the discussions we're having, all the crime shows we talk about have strong, iconic, rememberable characters at the heart of them. Every single one that's any good has that. And when you combine that with a story of the week, I think you're going to love it. So my guess is 3 years' time we'll be looking at those again.
So how long would your story of the week be in screen time? I mean,
60 minutes.
Right.
So, but what you'll do is,
And
more like
60 to 80% of that would be the story of the week.
yeah, exactly. So we'd have more like we used to make with Spooks, and Life on Mars, which was sort of 20% serial story, and the rest of it was the story of the week. And that, I think, we'll head back there.
I also think with trends, you sort of got to not go the other way, because the project will come, but say to people, actually, don't just think the trend's where we want to be, actually quite interested in something more conventional, but brilliantly done.
Because it seemed hugely revolutionary at the time when Morse was 2 hours long. And are you crazy? 2 hours? People aren't going to watch for 2 hours. But now, of course, with things like Netflix and all that kind of stuff, the way we're actually watching a crime drama is completely different. I mean, you can sit and watch. You can sit and watch Broadchurch in an afternoon if you're so inclined.
That is true,
change?
but again, this is where I don't really go with the Kevin Spacey argument, to be honest. I agree with what Peter Fincham was saying. There's a place for everything, and there's loads of different telling. Actually, I'm watching House of Cards the way that Kevin described it, but I love the fact that Broadchurch kept us on tenterhooks for 8 weeks. I love the fact that The Fall kept people on tenterhooks for 5 weeks. I think the thing about Twitter, which I see you have open there, is it's all about live. It's about the live moment. You know, it's quite hard to tweet about House of Cards because it's like, have you seen House of Cards? No, don't tell me anything.
Yeah.
Okay, but I want to be able to speak to you. Whereas watching Luther go out was hilarious.
Yeah.
It was like, oh my God, don't go up there. Why is she going up there? Oh my God, why is she there? Why is she? Whereas, you know, and part of the experience and the fun of that was people talking to each other in the moment. And obviously all the insaneness around who killed Danny would not be the same if it was...
That's about belonging, you know, and being of a tribe, and that's...
So I think there's, you know, different... I think I think the whole Netflix thing is good, but I think we need both types.
Well, the other thing that you get though with a long form is that you can really get inside a character.
Yeah.
And I think it's arguable that the key to the success of most crime drama is actually the character.
Yeah.
It's, you know, in years to come, you won't remember the ins and outs of a particular episode of Luther, but you'll remember Luther and Alice. You'll remember those characters. I mean, I can't remember anything about Morse other than it being a very subtle portrait over many years of a kind of lonely, frustrated individual.
The car and the music and the man. That's
right.
And then, of course,
Sorry, go on.
I was just going, and then what the crime does is it puts them under pressure.
Yeah.
So it brings out the most compelling bits of their character. So that bit with Gillian, I just think is amazing in The Fall. You know, that's not her having a conversation ordering Chinese. It's her having a conversation on the phone to a serial killer. So it absolutely is incredibly characterful. But its character is totally driven by the pounding force of genre. And again, that's what Broadchurch was as well. They were never just sitting around. You were always thinking, did she do it? Did she do that? Why did she say that?
But Prime Suspect, you know, is one of my all-time, well, I'm sure everyone's all-time favourite crime dramas. That I can't remember a single one of those crimes, apart from the cat. Actually, I can remember the victim's name, you're right, once, but I really couldn't tell you what happened in any of them. All I remember is the sort of feminist piece, as I interpreted it when it came out, this wonderful female character doing things you've never seen before and transgressing in a way that you just don't get. That's all you remember. So that's the fundamental truth of it, which is why the procedurals, quite frankly, I don't think they'll ever come back, or maybe not ever, never say never. Somebody will have a hit next year and I'll be here saying, aren't they brilliant? Please come and make one for us. But, you know, I think that the appetite has become so sophisticated now, I don't think we'll return to that sort of stuff.
But what Ben just called the pounding force of genre, whatever it happens, there are certain boxes you have to tick, certain genre expectations that the viewers have. So what do you think? Obviously, things like the portrayal of sex and violence has changed enormously since, you know, Dixon and Todd Green days. But what else do you think is fundamentally different? I mean, there's not a massive difference in my mind between Sherlock Holmes and almost any cop you see on TV.
I dispute. I fundamentally dispute this. If you look at the golden age of crime, exactly contemporaneously with that, noir fiction was developing in America, full of self-hating, first-person narrating, sexually twisted psychopaths.
That's true.
And that was happening at exactly the same time as
Lord
Peter Wimsey was doing his stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that it is in the nature of the genre that these two things always exist in some kind of equilibrium. And one is always slightly in the ascendant, but they're always, the battle's never won. And you know, and I think, in a sense, you know, the crime genre doesn't exist. It's a Broadchurch. I made the gag.
He said he would. We now all owe him £10.
That is painful.
Really bad. I told you not to say it.
Well, listen, I do want to open it up to the floor, and we have all this technology that enables us to look at people tweeting stuff in, which seems kind of odd. I mean, if you're out there and you're tweeting a question, put your hand up. For God's sake. How shy are you?
So
That's just ridiculous. But just before we go to the floor, just very quickly, you know, you've all talked about what you think goes into making great crime drama, and you will make great crime drama. So, your favourite crime drama? I'm going to go for Columbo. I'm going to kick things off with Columbo. I know it's not British.
Brilliant.
I know it's not British, but there you go.
It's an amazing format, that show.
Absolutely.
One favourite?
Yeah, just pick one. Or a couple if you have to.
On the telly?
Yeah, on the telly. On the telly box.
Oh dear.
Oh, for God's sake, come on.
We're hopeless, aren't we?
I'd probably say... I might say Sherlock Holmes with Jeremy Brett. Love them.
Mm-hmm.
I'd probably say Morse. House of Cards I don't think counts.
You got three now.
All right. I'd say, if I had to choose one, I'd say Morse.
Okay. Neil?
Columbo.
Yeah.
I'm going to do Ben's thing. Morse, Prime Suspect, Cracker.
You've said three.
And Top of the Lake recently, I think, is a groundbreaking piece of television. I really do. I think it's miraculous bit of new crime drama.
Okay, well, we got about 15 minutes to open up the floor. Are there mics? Are there roving mics? Yes, there are. There are roving mics. So if you have a question for anybody in the panel, please put your hand up. Was there a hand going up there at the front? Sorry? There we go. Gentleman at the front.
We've heard about your favourite shows. Is there any old show that you'd like to bring back with putting a new spin on it? And what new spin would you put on it?
Columbo.
But with another actor?
No,
you couldn't.
I watch a lot of old TV. I've just, for instance, when I get back, I've got 2 box sets of Budgie to watch. Yeah, Budgie.
I'll bring you around the room until I lose you.
Neil, I told you not to say that.
It's going to be announced. It was. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that we haven't had in crime drama in the last few years is recession-driven crime drama. Like Minder was ostensibly a crime drama, but it was all about surviving in a recession. Similarly, Budgie was a not dissimilar, and we haven't had that this time, which I think is kind of weird. But there's also, I mean, I love also. I don't want to give too much away in case I pitch it one day.
Well, we've been pitched all of them, obviously.
Absolutely.
But have any got any different spin on them?
It's about with any remake. It's always about why does the writer want to do it, and what's the writer got to say. So in a way, there's no show that's worth reviving unless someone comes and says, "Do you know what? Actually, this is the take on it."
This is why we did.
And actually, when you think about it with Sherlock, sorry, but you're not reviving a show, you're reviving a character.
No, and also
an
that could
iconic
be
character.
the worst idea ever.
It wasn't, though, was it?
No, it turned out all right, but it could have been really, I don't have seen as a film where Sherlock Holmes comes back to the modern day. He was frozen, admittedly, in the past, and then comes back to the modern day. So it's a little bit different. But it was awful, and it could have been awful.
I think Life on Mars is interesting. For Matthew and Ashley and Tony sat down when they were devising the idea for Life on Mars, and they wanted to remake the Sweeney, but they couldn't get the rights. So they said, right, what do we do? How do we do it so that we can't just make it in the 70s, because that would be weird. I know, let's put a cop from today back in the 70s so that we can remake the Sweeney. So when
because time travel's not weird.
Because time travel's not weird at all, it's complete. But, so someone brought me the Sweeney, I think we'd go, although they did make a successful movie of it 2 years ago. But that version, which is, with all crime drama, ultimately it's repetition of some of the tropes, some of the things that make it work, and then there's a wonderful variation or innovation that makes it work for now. And that's fundamentally, you don't actively look for that, but that's generally the ingredients that most of the
If I was
successful
ITV,
ones,
I'd want to remake Widows,
Yeah.
which I thought was a brilliant, wonderful into the plot, absolute best.
It's really tough. I mean, I think one of the odd things about the timelessness of crime fiction is that many of the most iconic crime shows, Widows, I'm sure accepted, are so tied in with the times that they're telling stories about.
Totally.
Like the original Prime Suspect, again, you could not remake.
No.
Because it is specifically a slice of that time politically. You could never have Dixon and Doc Green again. You just couldn't do it.
Anybody else? Yes.
So I'm really curious, what makes the Columbo stand out for you so much?
The joy of it. Columbo is it revels in its own absurdity. I'm not even sure I can define it. It's endlessly inventive.
But it's what a format.
What
an incredible format.
The
I remember
weekly
watching
format.
it as like an 8-year-old and just being totally gripped by how the jigsaw puzzle of how these murderers did the crime. Okay, so they're going to leave the salt in the water there, so they get hungry, so they go out of the room. This is what I've done to all of you, by the way. And then you have to drink water, and that drinking water's poison. Then all the intricacies of that. And then Columbo's got to be cleverer than the killer, or is he going to be? It's just like the most simple, brilliant film. And it means great writing.
It's a puzzle. It's like Sudoku every week, isn't it?
It is Sudoku every week. And
just this puzzle.
he is the least complicated character.
Yeah.
He's utterly benevolent. He's cunning and he's shrewd and he can see through into the dark hearts of men, but he is still good.
And heroic.
And heroic.
And it's also about class as well.
He's essentially, I mean,
they're all multi-millionaire kind of architects or film producers, and they think because he dresses like a tramp that he can't possibly have a mind like a steel trap. It's just brilliant.
But also, Columbo is the Doctor. I mean, Peter Falk is the only American who could have played the Doctor.
He could have, that's true.
So there we go. That's why we like Columbo. Any more questions? Yes, gentleman over there.
I'd just like to hear your take on the recent success of a Scandinavian crime series.
Well, they're marvellous.
Marvellous. We're just remaking one. We're just remaking the bridge for Sky Atlantic with the tunnel, which has been interesting. So we've had to delve deep into it. I think that's, they're great.
Again, it's about
long
the
form.
thing about The Killing is it all harks back to Agatha Christie, who hasn't been mentioned but should be, because she is extraordinary and her ability, she sort of created the whodunit really. And The Killing was, I don't mean this pejoratively, just a whodunit. That was brilliantly done, and that had time to make us go into a world that we were fascinated to go into, with characters we were really compelled by, who weren't reading the phone book out because it was about crime.
I kind of think that's
So
the key
it's
as well.
really conventional. I think it's like all the Broadchurch,
great
incredibly
female
conventional,
leads as well. Yeah,
but
absolutely.
incredibly bold. And actually, I think when those two things come together, you're playing by the rules, but you're also throwing the rules out the window. And I think it just is so satisfying.
But if crime drama, one of the things that's attractive about it is it takes you into worlds you don't get access to. I think the appeal of new worlds that we didn't get access to in Scandi drama was like, a whole new cities and new ways of working that we haven't seen before, which was just and again, it's the sort of variation on the traditional things, but that's new to us. And that
Like New Zealand, Neil.
Like New Zealand.
Like New
It's a
Zealand.
funny place. It's all going on there.
And blood looks really good against snow.
It does.
Let's not forget that.
But I think that the thing about, you can imagine a pitch where someone says, he's a detective on an oil rig, or on a, it's in an airport.
That is actually good though.
Is that so much of it is, if you're going to do a new crime drama, it's the world, we talked about it before, world creation. It's the world that it takes part in. And in Scandinavian drama, there is a whole new world, which is at once familiar and strange.
Do you not think there's also a slight snobbery that goes on where
Well,
people who
Yeah,
wouldn't dream of talking
absolutely.
about Midsomer Murders the next day at work will go, have you seen that new fantastic translation based on the Norwegian? In the same way that they wouldn't read what they call an airport thriller novel,
totally.
but as long as it's translated from the Danish.
People wouldn't watch it if they didn't like it. In the privacy of their own homes, they wouldn't watch it. They wouldn't continue to watch it.
And there's a lot of it,
and they're great. Those dramas were brilliant. I mean,
There's a lot that's not very good.
Yeah.
I mean, they're
on
not
telly.
on telly.
Yeah.
And all Scandinavian crime dramas are not The Killing.
Right.
And I watch everything in the world
When you're not watching Budgie.
when I'm not watching Budgie. And they're not. It's not as if as a nation they've tapped into some wellspring of genius.
Do you think we've just scraped that barrel
We've-
now a little bit?
I think we're starting to get there. Yeah.
Well, there is a darkness though in Scandinavian storytelling, which I think is appealing, definitely, isn't
Yeah.
it? There's a
But also,
sense
it's
of
lovely
appeal.
when you're acquiring ones because you just buy the good ones.
Yeah.
So it's you're like, The Killing, amazing. The Bridge, amazing.
But do you remember when?
You don't have to.
I mean, sadly, I don't think it worked quite so well on screen. But do you remember when the #1 ladies detective agency came? Again, is a very formulaic crime drama, but it's a wonderful character in a wonderful world that we've not seen before. So we'll be looking at
I do sometimes think I might just put some subtitles and things, so
Make it cool.
just
like
put
that.
it on.
What, something set in Newcastle?
Yeah.
Or something? Okay.
Just I think the
Way pet.
critics
How
will
are
just
you?
go, it's good.
Any more for any more? Because we do have some that have come through on the Twitter. Oh yes we have.
Tell
You're not
us.
going to like this.
Why
can't we compete with the popularity of US
Oh,
shows?
fuck off. Whoever said
Oh,
that.
there you go. Okay. Oh, fuck
Oh
off.
no!
from the
Who
panel.
asked that question? Because it's such bollocks.
I think
I'll tell you what,
I don't think there's anybody in
You're
here.
asking the three wrong people
Well,
here.
the thing is, if you go to America, because I'm working quite a lot in America at the moment, and I used this sentence yesterday, but it's true that in many ways, the British are the Danes of America at the moment, is they worship at the altar of British crime fiction. So in the same way that people will mention The Wire or whatever here, in America they'll talk about Broadchurch and Luther, obviously.
And Luther was
so-
a massive...
Neil
massive
Cross, Sam Miller, Ruth Wilson, Idris Elba all have careers in Hollywood now, and it's because of one show. It's because of Luther. So it's the most boring argument in the world, really, that they make really good television and we don't.
But also,
and frankly, don't work.
I was in the
telly.
States
Go
a
and
couple
get
of
a
weeks
job in
ago
America.
when Broadchurch premiered, and they went
It's
mental.
gone mental,
They
isn't
went
it?
absolutely mental. They have exactly the the opposite thing, which is why all these British actors are now getting cast in the lead of all these American cop shows.
Exactly.
Because, that's where all the good actors
And
are.
also,
that's where
the
all
truth
good
is,
writing is.
they see the best of ours, we see the
I
best
was
of
about to say,
theirs.
that isn't to
You
say
know,
that they don't make amazing, wonderful,
they
staggering
do.
crime series. They're extraordinary, but so do we. And
but
they're
also,
not
let
the
us
same thing.
the most popular show in America is NCIS LA. That is what American television is. American television is not The Wire. The Wire is for rich, posh people. Nothing wrong with it. We're all there to make programmes for everyone, and rich, posh people are important. But make no mistake, HBO is premium cable. You have to pay a lot of money, and it is for people who live in New York and Los Angeles, and that's fine.
Absolutely true.
But that's not normal mainstream people watching those shows. None of the shows that are talked about, Breaking Bad, none of them. They're all fantastic, but none of them are watched. There's a place for those. Top of the Lake didn't get a huge audience. It's fine, there's a place for those. But actually, American television is about NCIS, it's about CSI, just as British television is about BBC One and ITV. So we've got to be really careful that we don't start talking about television as a niche art form for niche people who live in cities and who are rich. There's a place for that. But we'd all be out of a job if we made stuff for that. And actually, television, a lot of television is there to be popular.
Well, we all like making popular, the 10.5 million people watch Broadchurch. That is a network hit in America. And it's ridiculous.
It's
and
brilliant.
Luther is millions, and there
It's
are
brilliant.
millions.
It's
You
brilliant.
don't, so we no.
But it's about mix as well. It's about the reason.
It's really touched a nerve.
I never thought that Top of the Lake, one of the most acclaimed shows in America, would be a huge show, but then you commission something that is a huge. So it's all about the mix, and it's the people who watch Death in Paradise are not going to like Top of the Lake and vice versa, and that's cool.
But it just comes down to that very simple equation: is that we get the best of theirs, they get the best of ours, and you can't judge what they do based on the outliers.
Anyway, let's move on.
But is there a degree to which, in order for you to have a couple of those shows that aren't the massive hits in terms of millions and millions of viewers, you need to also keep producing the ones that are? In the same way that actors will say, I make the shit movie to subsidise the arty theatre,
I got into television because I started watching EastEnders, so for me, popular television has always been at the heart of what I do, and passionate about. But I think that, and if you're not interested in, watching loads of people watching you, I don't really know why you'd be working in television, which is the mass art form in the country. But I think it's about a mix, and BBC is great. You can have a mix of shows, but BBC One is a big Broadchurch. Can't believe
Anybody
I
else?
said it.
Yes, madam.
How do you go about finding your actors and ultimately who gets the final decision over who it is? I'm like a really big Life on Mars fan, and I couldn't imagine those two central performances being anyone else.
Oh.
Can of worms there.
Yeah, don't say it.
There it is.
Everyone is not
there is
always...
a story I could tell about that, which I'm not allowed to tell.
But it's true
But
with...
you often start off with somebody different, and you end up with somebody, and you get lucky with the person who then didn't do it. And that's true of several of the shows I've been involved with. So Life on Mars, we had to, but truthfully, and Jane Tranter won't mind me saying this, we had to push Gene Hunt through. That was not, Phil Glenister was nobody's immediate thought for that part, because you just don't know who's going to turn up. He did an amazing audition, and it was a thing, and then no one else could have done it now, you imagine. So you get lucky a lot of the time.
Casting is a really difficult conversation. I mean, it's a wonderful conversation to have, actually, and it's often about, it's totally different from show to show. What's the show? What does the show need? Mostly it's just about great acting, famous or not, doesn't matter. If it's a singular crime, if it's a singular lead like Luther, you really need someone who's not necessarily famous, because Idris certainly wasn't, but someone who is a leading man. Got to be a leading man. There ain't many of them. But it's a total and utter random old game.
Yeah. I mean, Olivia Colman, I think, was the first person that we thought about for Broadchurch. And I now literally cannot imagine anyone else who have done that, and I think that was a tour de force of a performance, and extraordinary. But you know, a lot of it, honestly, is about the timing, the light. You just have to make those decisions.
As it is with every bit of the process, you just think, oh, this is, this feels right. Let's give it a go. God knows.
And fine actors make those iconic characters. I mean, Idris made
Yeah.
Luther. That's huge, charismatic, incredible.
But you never know. I remember, we auditioned Jamie Dornan, who was, a model who'd done Once Upon a Time in America and was known in typical tabloid way of being, the ex-boyfriend of a famous actress. And we all looked at him and we thought, he's great in the audition. I've no idea. I don't know, but he's great. Let's give it a go. And actually, fucking hell, he turned out to be brilliant. But it's a total, who knows?
And you can't imagine anybody but Peter Falk playing Columbo, but Peter Falk only played Columbo because Bing Crosby turned it down, because he had a golf tournament. Can you imagine if Bing Crosby had not had a golf tournament,
That's
how different
amazing.
television crime drama
But
would
that's
be?
so common, isn't it? That happens such a lot.
We've all got those. They're all good pub stories, aren't they, those ones?
We have unfortunately been beaten by time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Would you please put your hands together and show your appreciation for Jane Featherstone, Neil Cross, Ben Stevenson. Thanks for coming.